Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to be with you today on Tuesday, December 21st. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by Ben Smith, who's the media columnist for the New York Times. He joined the Times in 2020 after 8 years as the founding editor-in-chief, I should say, at BuzzFeed News. Before that, he covered politics for Politico, the New York Daily News, the New York Observer, and the New York Sun. Ben, welcome to GNAT-TV.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, great pleasure. An honor to have you on our program. I thought just to get us started, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the media equation, which is the column that you write for the Times. What do you follow and cover in the column?
Well, it's a weekly column about media, which is, takes in a whole lot of different stuff. Maybe always did, but I certainly am able to bend it to write about many, many different things. I mean, I think, the core big media stories are like, the news industry, the television industry, Hollywood. But I read a lot about politics. I spent most of my career as a political reporter. And I think a lot of what people in politics think about is basically media too at this point. In some sense, politicians, businesses are all producing content and competing with the people we think of media companies, for your attention on TikTok, television, everywhere else.
How do you select topics for the columns? How do they present themselves? Are you looking for something in particular when you separate sort of the newsworthy from the unnewsworthy when it comes to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think there are two things. One is that I'm sort of a believer in scoops. Like I like to break news, and I think that a good way to kind of hook people on something is to tell them something new. And I don't guess I have that much confidence in my own opinions that I just want to sort of lean back and opine. But I think once I've got some, interesting scoop, then I get a little excuse to opine because I've already got you. And that's sort of how I try to do it, is a scoop that bears on some genuinely interesting broader topic.
So, what do you see as some of the challenges and opportunities that are facing the news media, particularly the national news media today? I mean, it seems like every time you turn around, someone's saying, "Oh, fake news this, fake news that," or misinformation, disinformation. Where is this all taking us?
Well, I mean, I think, in some sense, the big story is polarization in this country and many others. And that has been great for business at the big national outlets, at the New York Times and the Washington Post in particular, which just, during the Trump years in particular, got lots and lots and lots of subscriptions from people who felt like the country was falling apart and that the Times and was in places like that were, sort of holding the, sort of keeping democracy together. The downside of that is then there's lots of people who don't just not read you, but who hate you and view you as a symbol of everything that's wrong with the world. And I think that's, they're the ones yelling fake news at the moment. I mean, so I think that's, there are these, I think, kind of big business opportunities essentially in a more kind of outspoken partisan media. And I think these national outlets that were traditionally more centrist are sort of grappling with how to navigate that.
Hmm. And I wonder what your take is for sort of the smaller and more local media that you might find outside of New York and Washington and other large metropolitan areas. I know there's been a lot of talk about how small newspapers and media outlets of one sort or another are struggling to kind of stay around and stay afloat during what's been a very challenging decade or so economically, as the internet and websites and whatnot have emerged. Do you sense that smaller papers like that have a reasonable chance at a robust future, or what are the challenges and opportunities that they're seeing?
I think a lot of the things that have been good for the national media have been bad for local media. I mean, in particular, the internet, often basically, if you think about a market on the internet, like shopping or search, there's like one or two sites. And I think for sort of general interest news, what you see is, places like the Times and the Post get more readers, sell more subscriptions, make more money, use that to hire more reporters and get better technology. And pretty soon, if you're the Columbus Dispatch, you're just so outmatched, and there are more subscribers to the New York Times and Columbus than there are to the Columbus Dispatch at this point, I would guess. Um, and so there's this sort of virtuous cycle for these big players that is a vicious cycle for the local guys. And the business of local media is really, really tough. I mean, the kind of, internet advertising just requires massive scale to make money. And if you're local, you're not getting that kind of national or global scale that, for instance, we used to get at BuzzFeed. And and the old businesses that powered local news, like classified ads, real estate ads, job ads, that's all gone to the internet. So I think for a number of different reasons, it's really hard to run a local newspaper. There has not been a lot of examples, or maybe really any examples, of a local newspaper just kind of making a seamless transition to the internet, or even any kind of transition to the internet, while maintaining the kind of, just the number of journalists that we used to be used to in a metro newspaper. And there are like a lot of exciting things happening on the local level, kind of smallish startups with 5 or 10 reporters, maybe a dozen reporters, a place called The Block in Chicago, doing great work. And by the way, they don't have to, worry about print deadlines and about all the kind of nonsense and space filling that goes with printing a newspaper. It's not like these newspapers were always so great, but it is just daunting to think about how little coverage there is of just like big local institutions, of school systems with 25,000 or 50,000 or a million kids in them, have 0 or 1 or 2 reporters covering them. It's crazy, and so I think you wind up with, well, I don't know, what I see at least is a lot of coverage of kind of like the national politics of school boards, and, school boards melting down everywhere, but the same nonsense. And like not that much coverage of like, this principal is terrible, this principal is good, like this just sort of stuff that is in fact happening in schools, just to pick an example.
What do you make of the nonprofit model that seems to be emerging in some places, where papers are underwritten by a foundation or some institution, and don't have to worry so much about kind of cracking the nut with advertising as much? Is that a pathway you see like smaller media kind of gravitating
Yeah.
towards?
I mean, I do think that it's a really basically great trend over the last few years. And in some sense, the kind of local rich people who used to fund the ballet and the museum and the opera and the homeless shelter, and, like the sort of work, both kind of, cultural and social service local nonprofits, now see journalism as kind of part of that civic fabric and something that is really important to maintain. I mean, there's also the just sort of money losing model where the owner of the newspaper is taking a loss, although it's not technically a nonprofit. A lot of local newspapers that are doing okay are kind of de facto nonprofits run by, public spirited local rich people. That of course there are problems with that model, as there are with everyone. I mean, I think, you are then very dependent on the goodwill of the local power brokers who you're also supposed to be covering, and also on the sort of whims and kind of fads that run through national foundations that give money to this and get obsessed with one thing this year and one thing the next year. And if you're not a little careful, I think you can wind up serving your donors rather than your audience. And where kind of a subscription model is particularly valuable is that you're very connected. Your business is very, very connected to serving your audience. And I think the challenge for nonprofits, I think, is basically like, you don't really have that much incentive to do stuff that people read. Your sort of business incentive is to do stuff that your donors will pat you on the head for. And you have to fight against that a bit.
Yeah, good point. I wanted to ask you about one column that you recently wrote, which basically was the one that gave me the idea to extend the invitation to you to come here. It was the one that was titled "Inside the Information" or "Inside the Misinformation Wars," excuse me, and it centered around the story of Hunter Biden's laptop and the information that was supposedly contained on the hard drive that he, I guess, dropped off at a repair shop to get fixed. And as you point out in the column, it became a very big deal towards the end there of the 2020 presidential election. And there was all kinds of wild theories and conjectures about what was on the hard drive, some embarrassing information of one sort or another. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the background of that column and what your takeaways were from that. I mean, it sounded like it was just sort of a dirty tricks deal in the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's, these stories are often really complicated and people want them to be simple. And that's sort of what I liked about this one. I mean, the reason I came across it was that a bunch of kind of fancy media executives were attending a course at Harvard on misinformation. And the first case study was this Hunter Biden laptop, which was around media. I think they were calling it media manipulation. And, it appears, though it's not absolutely 100% confirmed, but sure, there's no contradictory information that this was in fact Hunter Biden's laptop. It was full of genuinely embarrassing, both personally, but more indications of how he was using his famous name to try to cash in, and information. And I think rather than reckon with it on its merits, which weren't that interesting, it didn't indict Joe Biden. It just, like basically every president for the last 30 years has had some son or brother who's up to no good, and we found him. But it wasn't great. And I think a lot of both the media and Democrats reacted by saying, well, this is misinformation. They were obviously kind of coming off 2016, like this is a Russian hack, this is WikiLeaks. And it really wasn't any of those things. It was just a laptop somebody had found. And I guess my sort of broader view, my hobby horse that I use this to kind of ride a bit, was just that I think that there's a real danger to journalists, using this jargon like misinformation, often just to mean like this is something liberals don't like. And, conversely, the way Trump uses fake news just to mean facts he doesn't like. And I think, but journalists in particular, like I think should be more focused on engaging on sort of the merits of the information. Is this true? Is this false? Rather than to try to slap fancy labels on different kinds of information, because you wind up in this situation, as you wind up there, where people are essentially arguing that this is both true and it's misinformation. And I don't think that's really a tenable position.
Yeah. So I'm trying to remember now. In the end, I don't think anything really came of that whole laptop story.
The Wall Street Journal published a story saying there's some embarrassing stuff on here that stopped short of saying what the Trump people wanted, which was, Joe Biden secretly got rich off of these something, question mark, not clear what exactly happened. The New York Post went with that kind of headline, but I think that hasn't really been, there's not strong evidence for that. And so responsible journalists didn't write the story. But the way in which, in particular, the big platforms, Facebook, Twitter, kind of stepped in to block this story, kind of misidentifying it essentially as misinformation, I think is pretty troubling. And I think there's an impulse, I don't know, on the left and also sometimes among journalists to kind of go running to the platforms and say, here's this thing we don't like and find suspicious, stop it. And maybe that's sometimes the right call, but also it can definitely be a little scary in its own way.
Yeah. Well, what is your take in general around social media and media that puts forward news? Whether it's Facebook or some other platform. I mean, it seems to be changing and having an influence on news gathering that's just enormous. Is there something to be worried about with all of that, or is this just sort of a natural evolution of how things are going, and we'll eventually come up with a happy medium with all of this?
That's a big question.
I probably should have phrased that differently, but
I guess I think there are these huge political, social changes that come with social media. And I think, it's sort of the job of sociologists and historians to figure out, there's obviously this upsurge in kind of right-wing populism all over the world. A lot of that is kind of driven by social media. There are sort of false stories being circulated by social media, but also a lot of those things, right-wing populism, people believing in nonsense, aren't totally new. And there's, and there are other factors, historical and economic, that are part of that story. And so I guess I kind of like resist. I think that you sort of often wind up with arguments over either everything you see is the fault of social media, or alternately, social media is really just like a reflection of what's happening in society. And clearly the answer is somewhere in the middle. I think for journalists, it's double-edged. I mean, it has undermine trust in media, I think, because you've seen because regular people can challenge and question journalism that, by the way, was often not that great historically. And so, some of the trust that we commanded was probably based on a bit of an illusion that this is shattered. On the other hand, a lot of, I think, consumers are really disoriented about like, what can you trust, what shouldn't you trust, and now have a system that basically serves them whatever they want to hear, formatted however they like it instantly. And while that has also historically been true in all sorts of different media, it's clearly a very this sort of capture of people's brains by Facebook is pretty impressive, and it sort of feeds that kind of polarization that we're all navigating. I mean, and Twitter, meanwhile, is just this central news wire for all news in the world instantly that is totally unprecedented in human history, and a lot of I am totally addicted to it, honestly, but also, you sort of live totally, it can sort of suck you into what's important in this moment, and the context around that can really collapse. I think it is a big risk.
Mm. Well, what do you make of the idea that social media platforms can kind of publish, well, whatever they want, or whatever people give them? I mean, I know they also then try to regulate that and kind of label things as misinformation or whatever. But if a newspaper or a radio station or a television station were to publish some of the same stuff, they'd be sued for libel. I mean, with the Section 230 business, right. I guess. Do you think that there's some way that should be more of a level playing field, or is it, again, just something we'll have to work out?
I think the kind of like analogy, like Facebook either is or isn't a newspaper. It doesn't really work. Like, it is a new kind of thing, and it doesn't, I think, make sense that, if you libel someone in a newspaper, that I can go and sue the guy who sold you the paper for libel. And one part of what Facebook does really is just supply the paper on which you go and libel someone. And then the other thing they do is distribute it really, really widely, and amplify it. And I think that the most interesting conversations about how to fix the platforms aren't about saying you shouldn't be allowed to post this and they should delete it, or they should be responsible for its existence, which is what Section 230 protects them from. But I do think once the platforms are essentially through a set of algorithms making a decision, we're going to show this thing to 50 million people. I think the question then is there some threshold maybe at which they start to bear more responsibility?
Yeah, because as a former small newspaper editor myself, I used to kind of get, bang my head sometimes that some of the things I'd read on social media that I think, wow, if I ever published that, I'd be out of a job anyway.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And I think, Facebook groups right now are this incredible source of both incredible local information, right? Like I lost my dog. And by the time I got to the Facebook group, somebody had posted a picture of my dog and they'd found it. And if a local coffee shop changes its hours slightly, even the most diligent of local newspapers might not write that story. But it's something I would like to know, that the coffee shop's opening an hour earlier, and somebody will post that in the local Facebook group. So there is a level of kind of wonderful granular local information and connection with your neighbors that is a gift of that social media has brought along and is valuable. On the other hand, if as happened recently in my neighborhood Facebook group, a local coffee shop owner is accused of firing a favored barista unfairly, there's nowhere worse to arbitrate that than a Facebook group. It's a disaster. And in some ideal world, an earnest local reporter, if this is important to people, can go and fairly report the story. And that's just not a thing that can happen on social media.
Mm. I wanted to return to a point I think I heard you mention earlier, which is about the trust and credibility in national media. Why is it, do you feel like so many other major institutions, I mean, Congress being one, just when it comes to mind, that the public seems to have much less trust in them? I mean, is there a kind of a direct line from point X to point Y that explains that, or is that just sort of the nature of the times?
I mean, I think there's a lot. I mean, I guess I feel like this is always my answer, but I think there's a lot of different things going on, and there's not one cause. I mean, one interesting thing though is if I asked you, do you trust the media? Like, I don't know. I'm not sure I trust the media, capital T, capital M. I'm not sure what that means. If you ask people, for instance, do they trust Fox News? Like 50% of Americans say yes. Like, that's a decent number, right? You ask people, do they trust the New York Times? A lot of people say yes. If you ask people, do they trust their local newspaper? Even more say yes. And so I think that number is a little misleading. It's kind of, I think a lot of people take the media to mean like the people I disagree with out there, as opposed to this one thing that I really like and trust.
Hmm.
And so, and it used to, right. And I think that, that to some degree is about polarization too.
Right. Right. Yeah. Another point I wanted to ask you about was it's come up a couple of times. I've noticed in some discussions I've been reading about media is like whether or not the old model of a reporter writing a story that sort of is on the one hand this, on the other hand that, kind of was trying to go straight down the middle of the stories, pointing out both sides of it, versus calling out politicians or business figures or whoever is being written about if they can be proven to be lying or saying something inaccurate. Is there a feeling you have about, that old model that might have worked 50, 60 years ago needs to be re-examined at this point so that a reporter writing a story might actually have a point of view on it and tell the story, give the facts, but also be sort of not just sort of an impartial, neutral observer?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think there's always been a pretty wide variety of kinds of journalism, and that both of those kinds have always been, it waxing or waning. And certainly, like, sort of second half of the 20th century, these big American metro papers had this style that was, they were selling ads to both Republicans and Democrats who wanted to buy mattresses and were trying to not offend anybody. And, and I think that kind of created this on the one hand, on the other hand voice. I mean, I guess I tend to think it depends a lot on the story. Like, you should write what you know is true, and you not force, and and if one person is obviously lying, you don't have to, and it because you figured out the facts, you don't have to give it equal weight. But conversely, I think sometimes people sort of interpret that idea to mean that they always need to pick a side. And the reality is, like, we don't know what the hell we're doing a lot of the time. Like, you often got assigned a story like 6 or 7 hours ago about people who have been fighting over something for 35 years. And, like, it's pretty plausible that by the end of the day, you have not figured out who is right. And you shouldn't guess. So I don't know. I think it actually depends a lot. I guess that's my, on one hand. On the other hand, I think there are stories and kinds of stories where that's really valuable and right, and where the sort of tradition of allowing a politician just to lie to your face is dumb. But then there are others where you see, there's a whole sort of fact-checking infrastructure now, and sometimes you'll see these fact-checkers check claims like the economy is good. And it's like, I don't know, I'm not sure that's like a fact to check. That's a political theory and people's experience and lots of other stuff. And I think there's a kind of humility that it's really important to hang on to in this business, because you want to be able to be surprised and realize that you were wrong about something.
Yeah, really. Well, and before I let you go, in a couple of minutes we have left, what are some of the real exciting things you see going on at the Times nowadays? It seems like I read the paper now almost entirely online. I used to be a dedicated, hard copy guy, and my Sundays used to revolve around reading the entire Sunday Times, basically from cover to cover. But now I just sort of absorb it all online. I guess there seems to be a lot of really interesting journalism going on that's melding kind of video and a lot of visual stuff with the story as well.
Yeah, I think, the Times, for the publications, the Times first of all, that are sort of benefiting from this huge scale and this centralization, there's lots of exciting stuff. These kind of, I do think, visual investigations, which I think the Times really learned from this outlet called Bellingcat, this British outlet, but of breaking down a video frame by frame until you really understand what is happening and can kind of explain it. And this, you see some of the coverage of the January 6th insurrection in this forum is really powerful and interesting. I think there's also this capacity to send a reporter out for months or years just to like figure out what was going on in a very, very deep way that you see with Azmat Khan's reporting over the last couple of days on American drone strikes in Afghanistan, where she just basically incredibly painstakingly checked out the military's claims and talked to the people who they had bombed. And, there's no real shortcut to that. And so I think in general, I think some of the international reporting is really rich and interesting and challenges what Americans are being told by the government.
Yeah, that was quite a powerful story. Yeah, it must have been an incredible amount of work. It certainly seems like there's a lot of interesting and exciting things going on. I look forward to kind of seeing what you and all of your colleagues come up with as we go forward into a new year. I'm sure it's going to be an interesting one.
Yeah, maybe slightly less interesting would be okay.
Yeah, that would be all right, definitely, for sure. It feels that way right now, anyhow. Well, Ben, thank you again for making the time for this discussion. I really appreciate it. It's a real honor to have you on our show. And well, we'll be following what you're doing in the media equation and what all of your colleagues are doing as well over there.
Thank you for having me on.
My pleasure, sir. Thank you very much, and best for the holidays as well.
You too. Take care.